Hi, welcome to this episode of Color Correction in Premiere Pro. I'm going to be doing a couple sessions on this. Upcoming, I will have, right now this one that I'm doing, this is going to be on primary color correction within Premiere. And this is not necessarily on the Lumetri panel. I've got a separate episode coming up on the Lumetri panel. On this episode, I'm going through the actual video effects here and the color correction filters in here and some of the more useful color correction filters in their folder under the effects panel. The Lumetri panel is a bit different. These filters here actually have a lot more, I guess you could say, power involved on these filters here. It takes a lot more manual manipulation than they do with the Lumetri panel. The Lumetri panel is kind of meant to do quick on-the-fly color correction, where these color correctors in here that I'm going to be going over are getting down to the nitty-gritty and really being able to control your color correction. But we are, however, going to be using the Lumetri panel scopes to do the color correction, because the old original scopes like the YC waveform have been replaced with the Lumetri scopes now inside of Premiere, and they actually work a lot better than the previous ones. They've been updated, they're more current, and they have a lot more options under the scopes. So when we're talking about color correction in general, or maybe I should say color grading, because you're not necessarily going just over correction. You're not just necessarily correcting shots, but you're actually you're adding a look to them, you're making them look a very specific way, you're matching. So it's just not correction just straight out. So in general, it's probably better to call it color grading than it is to call it color correction. But we have three different goals when it comes to color correction. One of the first goals is legality, meeting broadcast legality. If you're sending something to a broadcast station, or just in general, it's a good idea to keep things within legal limits. And we'll show you what those are as we start doing the color grading itself. But you want to make sure that your highlights aren't too high and your dark regions aren't too dark where you're losing a lot of detail. You'll want to keep it within, and also within saturation limits as well. Second goal that I'm going to mention is matching. As you cut from shot to shot, you will want to make sure that your shots match color, generally speaking, and that you can also conform brightness levels and contrast. So as you cut from shot to shot, that is our second goal there. And our third goal is going for a specific look, trying to give everything a cinematic look and have the film give a certain sort of either wash or contrast look to give that cinematic feel in the end. Now, within doing each one of these goals here, there are basically two steps that you're covering within each goal. Within legality, matching, and looks, you're going to be looking at tonality and color. So within legality, you're going to be adjusting tone and color. Within matching, you're going to be adjusting tone and color, and also your looks in the end. Within tonality, it's basically you're dealing with brightness and contrast. And within brightness and contrast, you're going to be adjusting what are called your darks, your mids, and your highlights. Those are basically the items that don't deal with the color end of things as much as the brightness levels, is a way you can kind of look at tonality. And color is going to be dealing with two major items. It's really hue and saturation. Hue is the general color shade of an image, and saturation is going to be how intense that color is. And we're going to be getting into that and showing how to deal with that by looking at scopes. So within Premiere now, we're going to go into the effects panel. I'm going to show you a couple of the filters that are some of the better filters to work with, in my opinion. A lot of these are kind of dumbed down features of a couple of the more powerful effects, and some of the more powerful ones are going to be your fast color corrector, your Luma curve, your RGB color corrector, your RGB curve, and your three-way color corrector. In this episode specifically, we are going to be going over the fast color corrector, the Luma curve, and the RGB curves, and we'll go over other filters in upcoming episodes. Especially as we get into secondary color correction, we'll be covering the three-way color corrector, but not in this episode. We're going to go over the basics here. So if you want to add an effect to a clip, first of all, you have to have your effects panel open, and you grab the filter that you want, and you just simply drag it and drop it onto a clip. Nothing has affected the clip here, and you make sure that you have your playhead over the clip while you're going to be affecting it. We're going to go through a different workspace arrangement here in a second, but I want to make sure that you understand how to add filters and how you manipulate those filters as well. If you need to, go back to a previous episode. On that episode, in fact, I'll put the link right here, and that link will show you how to add effects and control those effects. If you don't understand that, I'm going to be zipping through this pretty quickly. And under this effects control panel, now I have access to the filters that I've added to this specific clip down here. All right, I'm going to show how to set up a workspace for your new color correction environment. Premiere comes preloaded with this color workspace right here. If you click on that, but this really loads it just for the Lumetri color panel. They've kind of gotten rid of the arrangement for their original color correction. If you want to get into some more powerful color correction than just the Lumetri panel and really have a lot more control, they don't have an arrangement specifically for that sort of color correction. So I'm going to recommend making your own arrangement here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go under the first of all, I'm going under the editing workspace right here, the regular editing workspace, and I'm going to go under window. What we really need to use here are going to be the Lumetri scopes. So I'm going to choose Lumetri scopes. scopes and add that here to my kind of source area right there. The goal is to be able to see the effect control space and the lumetri scopes at the same time, because as you're affecting your shots, you'll want to be able to see what's happening on your scopes at the same time. And we need to see the program monitor as well. So I'm going to grab this effect controls. I'm going to grab this and drag it out, and I'm going to drag it over here to the left, and make sure you don't drop it on any of these little blue spots right there. Right now, I still got a hold of the effect controls. I'm going to move it way over to the left, over to the very, very edge, and suddenly you'll see this little gray bar show up on the edge. That means it's going to make its own very own window space for the effect controls on the left side. If I let go of that, it has created its own space for it. It's kind of smashed everything else over. So all I have to do is grab this little edge right there, drag it over, and reveal my lumetri scopes. There's my scopes. Here's my effect control panel. Here's the effect panel down here. Also, you have access to your project panel, everything down here. Okay, so once I have this arrangement the way I like it, I'm going to go up to Window, Workspaces. I want to save this as a new workspace. I don't want to replace it on the workspace that I'm working on, which is editing. I want to keep that workspace. So I'm going to save this new arrangement as a new workspace, and I'm going to call this color correction. I'm going to hit OK. I already arranged this, so it's saying, do you want to replace the one that exists? Sure, I'll replace it. Now I've got that color correction up there, arrangement for this specific type of color correction. So now as we grab a filter here or an effect, we drag it and drop it onto a clip. It'll show up here in this panel, and you have your scopes as well. So now when you start affecting things over here in this panel, let's grab our mids and boost this up. You'll see the scope is affected as well. Because you need to get good, accurate color correction, you're going to need to use scopes, as well as you're going to have to be able to see scopes at the same time as you're affecting your clips. So let's show how the scopes work first, and then I'm going to start showing you how these actual filters work. So as I start adjusting these, I'm not explaining the filters quite yet, or the effects, but I want to explain the scopes and show how those work. So right now, I'm going to right click in this lumetri scope area here, and you might already have something by default showing all these scopes popping up like this. And if you do, all you have to do is right click in this area. The three more effective scopes that I use, in my opinion, are going to be the waveform monitor, the YUV vector scope, and the RGB parade. These ones are also helpful, your histogram and your HSL vector scope, but I'm just going to be showing mainly your RGB parade, YUV vector scope, and your waveform over here. I'm going to right click in here and get rid of the HSL and get rid of the histogram. Now this one we're going to be using for luma values or tonality. So since we're going to be using this one for just tonality, I'm going to get rid of, right now it's blending all three color channels. First of all, video works in three different channels. You have a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. It's basically like this. We have one channel that is showing pretty much all the red values in the image, and a green channel which is showing all the greens, and a blue channel which is showing all the blues. And within each one you'll have darker reds, darker greens, lighter greens, and so on. And as you blend these three channels together, you basically get what's called RGB color, red, green, blue composite image, and it ends up looking like we're used to seeing things. Now when it comes to color correction, you're able to manipulate each one of those individual channels. That's what we're going to be using the RGB channel for. But this here, this waveform, is blending all three channels together in one waveform. As a standard, we're going to be looking at the waveform monitor in Luma format as opposed to this RGB format right here where it's blending all three channels. It's just going to show the brights. So I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to go down to waveform type. I'm going to tell it to just show Luma. And now it's just showing the Luma values of this image as opposed to the RGB values, which I'm going to be using in this parade here. But right now, let's get rid of our parade, get rid of our YUV, and talk about the waveform. The waveform monitor is basically showing your darks, your mids, and your highlights. Your darks, now this is what's called an IRE scale. At the bottom here, we have 0. IRE stands for Institute of Radio Engineers. It's basically a standard setup to measure video brightness levels and contrast levels. What this represents here is this goes from the left to the right-hand side of the screen, showing from here to here as it moves across the monitor here, across the image. And from left to right, it is showing the darker areas. What 0 represents is where detail disappears in the dark areas of this image. And what happens at 100 is basically the opposite. It's where details disappear in the highlights of the image. So as we move from left to right here, we're seeing some kind of darker area here, and this is kind of like likely his hair. And as you move across, then you get into his ear and his face. And as you're moving across here, then it just kind of moves off into the mid region for the rest of the image right here. So the mids are kind of around anywhere from like 30 to 70 thereabouts. They're very adjustable mids within that region. Usually good well exposed images with their mids will end up around in between 40 to 60. So as we manipulate this, if we go down here and we grab our darks and bring them down, you'll notice as we start to hit 0 there and we're crushing, now we're starting to lose detail in the darks. Let me put that back. And same on the highlights. As we bring the highlights up, and we pump those up and we start hitting 100 and they start clipping, we're starting to lose a lot of detail in the highlights, just so you know how that works. And you can see that on here. So when you're adjusting an image and fixing it, if things are clipping up here, you're going to be able to grab your highlights and bring them down and hopefully be able to restore some of those highlights depending on how overexposed the shot was. With your vector scope now, let's go over the vector scope. The vector scope, basically, this shows two different things. This shows hue, which is your basic color balance of your image, and this also shows saturation. So on the vector scope up here, we've got your red channel, your blue channel, and your green channel. It also has the kind of the in-between colors. It shows your mixture of red and greens, which give you your yellows, a mixture between here, which is your magentas, and your cyan here. So we'll see kind of a general hue. We see a bunch of concentration of pixels kind of heading off toward the red here. Not as many that are a bit oversaturated as they come out from this midpoint right here and toward these colors. So we have kind of a general red hue, but as they reach further and further out, it's a heavier concentration or more intense red than normal. So as we go from this point here, this middle point means no color. As it starts stretching out from this point, it's going to be more color. It's basically saturation. So watch what happens as we grab our saturation here and we turn it down. Notice it starts shrinking in toward the middle. As it sucks all the way into this little fine point there, we have no color left in this image here. And as we grab the saturation and we bleed it out and we go over saturated, then you're going to see we have heavy saturation and we've got some heavy yellows and reds and a teeny bit of blues in there. And you're going to be able to use these scopes to be able to get to gauge your colors and see how much saturation or the general hue of a shot, the general kind of color range that's in a shot. And it is very helpful to have this scope here for a couple different reasons. One, that every monitor is a little bit different. Unless you have a professional monitor and you have it calibrated and you know how to calibrate it, then the monitor is likely not displaying accurate colors, and it's really difficult to get those unless you have some sort of hardware that will calibrate your monitor to display accurate colors. And the other one is color blindness, and this is mainly something that males will suffer from and not females, because it's like a gene that about, I think, 5 or 10% of all males have, which is this color blindness gene. And if you want to see if you are colorblind, there's a bunch of tests online that you can use to determine whether or not you are colorblind. Just Google colorblind test and you'll be able to see if you have a specific color blindness, which is kind of a green, red, orange sort of color blindness. It doesn't mean you're completely colorblind. It just means you have, when the colors kind of get closer and closer together, you have trouble differentiating between those colors. So right here, there's one of the colorblind tests. Right here, everybody should be able to see a 16 just fine, whether you have no color vision at all. You should be able to see, even in black and white, you should be able to see this. Now, as we go to the next one here, it says, what do you see in this test plate? I see nothing. I have that color blindness. I'm one of those 10%. I click on here for the right answer. It says you should see 2. I seriously do not see a 2 in here at all. So, and if you don't, that means you have suffer from the same color blindness as I do, and that's where scopes come in handy. I see colors. I see like green and kind of lighter shades of green and blue in here, but I don't see that number. So I do have that color blindness, and that's why the scopes are going to come in handy. One for monitor calibration purposes, and one because I'm stinking colorblind. Let's go to the next scope here. I'm going to reset my filter, and let's talk about the RGB parade. So this is very similar to the waveform. From the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the red here, this represents your image from left to right, the full image, just like the waveform, but it shows your red channel values. And here shows your green channel values and your blue channel values. And I can see that this has kind of a heavier push in the mids on the red, and I see that the blues are a little low, and then I see kind of a little spike in the highlights on the blue, and it's likely from like the glasses right there, reflecting kind of the bluish sunlight, the silverish sunlight. So this is going to come in handy to basically color balance a shot when you see a heavy shift in these 3 color channels, generally speaking. One other thing on the vector scope here I didn't mention was that this is kind of a representation. You'll see in your fast color corrector a wheel that represents this YUV, that represents this vector scope here. And you'll see the same colors. Up here is red, right here's your blue, and green. So it matches those areas right there. And also on this vector scope, you'll see these points out here. These are your HD saturation broadcast limits. So there we're talking about legality limits right there, and you don't want to saturate past those points to meet broadcast requirements. Same as on the waveform here, the legal areas are going to be 0 and 100. You don't want to ever really touch 0, and you don't want to touch 100. You want to keep them away from those things to keep these what are called broadcast safe. So let's start doing some color correction with the fast color corrector. Okay, so once we want to put a color corrector onto a clip, I'm going to simply go down and grab my fast color corrector here. One thing you can do, instead of like going down through all these folders, if you know which one you're looking for, you can click in the search engine, type in fast. There's my fast color corrector right there. I'm going to drop it onto my clip. So now I have the fast color corrector added here. Three major things in here on the fast color corrector. This thing comes across as quite intimidating when you first look at it because it's got a lot of controls. There's three major things in here. Once you get these down, you pretty much have the whole effect down. Right here, you've got your hue, balance, and angle. Basically, as we grab this, let me bring up our vector scope YUV. As you grab this little wheel in the middle and start dragging it, it's going to boost colors in a different area. As I'm pulling this more toward the blue, notice it's boosting this over to the blue, making the image very blue. As you grab this and just rotate it around, you'll see that it is boosting the colors to the region that you're dragging off to. So it's boosting the colors in the reds, boosting the colors in the blues and the cyans as I rotate this around. Now what this is doing, this is not changing the saturation necessarily as much as grabbing this entire hue range and just shifting it into a different region here. You can also gain this. If you grab the gain and push this, it's taking that whole region and boosting it off toward the blues. So this is your little gain slider. Very rarely will you use this. And then this is your hue wheel right here. Now, if you get this in a certain region, you can actually grab the angle here, and this is rarely used as well, but it's helpful once in a while if you're just trying to tweak a little bit. And you grab this and rotate it. What it does is it takes that entire value of hue and just rotates it on this axis here. It just rotates it. You can see that rotating around in a circle and changing the hue completely, rotating it on this axis. Gonna reset this. The next thing that's really helpful to know is this saturation slider right here. As you grab that and you drag it to the right, notice it takes that hue and expands this entire hue image right here and starts expanding it out towards these points. So as this is adding color, or as you drag it inside, it takes the color down and decreases the saturation, and we end up with a black and white image as it sucks into this point. Reset that. And the last thing is your input and output sliders. Basically what this one does here, watch what happens on our waveform. As I grab this dark slider and drag it in, it takes the darks down lower. As you drag the dark slider in or the white slider in, think of this as exaggerating these points. It's taking the darks down, it's taking the highlights up. As I drag this highlight slider inward, it's exaggerating the highlights. As I drag the dark slider in, it exaggerates the darks. On the output, it's the opposite. You grab the output slider and drag the output levels in, it's basically unexaggerating them. It's making them more flat. It's taking the darks up, and as you grab the whites, it takes your images down. And look what's happening. We're getting a very flat image. Keep in mind that as your darks and your highlights get closer and closer together, you're going to have less contrast. Contrast is defined as the stretched region between your darks and your highlights. If you have more contrast, you have a larger region between your darks and your highlights, and you create more contrast. If they get closer together, your image ends up looking flat. So this is kind of helpful sometimes if your highlights are too high, you can bring them down a little bit, or if your darks are too flattened, you can bring them up a little bit. And usually with DSLR footage, you'll have to do that a little bit because it doesn't have quite a dynamic range like red footage does. And then right here, you've got basically your exposure meter. This is your mids. You're boosting your mids, and it's basically increasing or decreasing the exposure, the general exposure of the shot. And that's pretty much how everything in the fast color corrector works. As you change these things here, don't worry about the numerical areas because as you move it, it is adjusting the numerical regions for you. Watch as I move here, you'll see the numerical versions. These are just the visual slider portions, and you'll see the numerical versions change as you change these wheels. And that's really all there is to this, unless you're doing some auto stuff, which I'm not going to show because we're showing how to do all manual stuff here. So let's do some correction on this. First of all, right now, I have a very flat image, and I've got everything kind of pulled together, and this image doesn't look very cinematic. What I'm going to do right now is just make sure that everything is kind of broadcast legal. If I do have highlights, right now this shot is pretty well exposed. This was shot on the red, and it was pretty well exposed. Let's go to the next shot here, and I'm going to see that I do have some highlights up near 100. So one thing I'm going to do is make sure this is broadcast safe. I'm going to grab my highlights and just drag them down. So one thing I want to be aware of is, first of all, right now, I've got this clip selected, and I've got the playhead over this clip. So watch what happens. As I grab the mids and move them up and down, it is not adjusting this image right here, but actually, if I go to the clip before, it is adjusting the clip that I have selected. That's one thing you got to keep in mind. Three things here. You have to have your effect control panel open, have to have your playhead over the clip, and you have to have the clip selected. 2015 updates have a nice little addition here, is under sequence, and selection follows playhead. So once you're in the color correction mode, I'd say have this check marked, because now as you move the playhead, it automatically selects the clip that it's over, and there's no mistaking which clip you are correcting. Kind of a nice little feature there. It's kind of obnoxious to have while you're editing, but it's really nice while you're color correcting. I'm going to grab this fast color corrector, drop it onto that clip, and let's start correcting this. I'm going to grab my input slider on the highlights. I'm going to grab the output levels, and I'm going to bring down the highlights just a teeny bit, just to get them away from 100, right around 95, just to make sure they're not peaking and this is broadcast safe. Same as the darks. The darks, I am actually touching 0. I'm going to grab my output levels here and bring up the darks just a teeny bit, so they're above that. But now we can create a stretch. Right now this is looking a little more flat than we may want it in the end, but what we're going to do is take this region and stretch it and get contrast out of this later. So keep that in mind. Right now our first goal is to meet legal requirements. And now I'm going to look at this image and say, do I need to expose this anymore? Do I need to underexpose it anymore? And I'm going to bring up the exposure just a teeny bit. And there I go. So let's go to this previous clip and kind of do the same thing. Right now my darks are actually, instead of touching 0, they're not quite dark enough. So I'm going to grab my input levels instead and drag it down right around 5 IRE. Like around 3 to 5 IRE is nice. My highlights aren't too bad here, so they're looking fine. So now I can just grab my mids and adjust those and get my exposure exactly where I need it. Moving to the next clip. Same thing here. Add my fast color corrector, grab my exposure. My exposure is up a little too much. Let's get this guy in focus here so we can see what we're doing. My highlights are fine. If I want to, I could bring those highlights just down a titch. My darks, I need to bring my darks down just a little bit. And there we go. Okay, let's talk color. So that's basically your brightness levels, getting them meeting legal requirements. Let's talk about saturation now. So we're going to bring up our YUV vector scope. We're going to get rid of our luma, and let's look at our colors here. One thing I want you to notice is this shot right here has kind of some heavies and yellows, and what we can do here if we want to change a little bit of that, back off those heavy yellows and reds, so we can grab our hue and balance and kind of just slightly drag it over toward the opposite region and cool that off a teeny bit. But I'm going to show you kind of a better way of getting this balance, but that is one way you can kind of quickly get this balance, is just dragging your hue off to a different direction and possibly even changing your saturation. Let's show you an example where you can change your saturation. Right here, this shot is heavily saturated toward the yellows. So I'm going to grab my fast color corrector, drop it onto that clip. I'm going to go to my wheel here and drag this off toward the blues. And we're getting a little bit more of a better color balance, but I'm also going to grab my saturation. Here, I'm getting a big heavy boost in the yellows. I can actually just drag my saturation down a teeny bit. Let's take it down to about 90%. I'm grabbing this. That's about 80% there, 79%. Let's look at before and after. There's before. There's after. The way you can test that is just by check marking your filter on and off, seeing the before and after. And that's looking a little bit more natural there. I also have to fix my waveform on there. So let's look at our waveform. My highlights are a little too high. I'm going to bring down my highlights. My black levels are about right. The exposure could stand to come up just a teeny bit. There we go. As we play to this next clip, this was shot with a completely different camera and somebody didn't color balance their camera quite properly. So as we cut from this shot to this shot, they look completely different. So a way to get these balanced here, I'm going to show a good way to get these shots where they're matched. This is where we're going to bring up the RGB parade. And we see that this shot has a heavy boost in the blues and a kind of a mild, a slightly heavier boost in the greens. One way we can do this, let's show it with a fast color corrector, but then I want to show a slightly different way of doing this. We can grab our color wheel here and watch this as we move this around. You'll see these color channels shifting. If you can get those to where they're pretty similar, right about there, then we look at the shot. That looks a lot better. Watch this. We uncheck it. Here's the before and after. And these two now look way more close to each other. We still need to adjust our input levels. I'm going to go back to the waveform monitor. But look, as we just shift this wheel around, though, we're getting these three channels to where they match, to where they look a little closer. And you'll have a lot more power in manipulating these with the RGB curve effect. But this did a big deal here. This got it more adjusted where it needs to be. Let's go under our waveform. Get rid of our parade, and let's get our brightness levels set here. First of all, this is a bit overexposed, so I'm going to grab that and just drag it down a little bit. My highlights are a little bit peaking, so I'm going to bring my highlights just down a titch, and my dark levels stand to be brought down just a little bit as well. Now that shot is looking more close to that shot. Actually, those match pretty darn well there. So now that we're done, that's basically matching right there. You want to go from shot to shot, make sure that your broadcast legality matches, that your brightness levels match, and that your colors match. Once we're done with that, I'm going to be adding another filter here. I'm going to find a curve, because now I want to get this looking a little more cinematic. I'm going to go under Curve, Luma Curve. I'm going to drop this onto a clip here, and I've got my Luma curve over here. Basically, the way a curve works is you've got down here at the bottom left-hand corner, let me expand this and show. This is really going to help with contrast without killing the details in your darks or your highlights. Because how a curve works is basically this is your dark point down here and this is your highlight point up here. As you grab this and drag it up to the left, notice it is lifting the darks in this region. This is your dark node, this is your highlight node, this is your highlight region, and your dark region. So you grab the dark node and drag them up to this, it's going to bring them up toward the highlight region. It's going to exaggerate them and bring them up. As you grab the highlights and do that as well, it's going to boost the highlights. Eventually, if you get up here, it's just going to destroy it and make it all white, like that. We're going to reset that. And if you grab your highlight region and bring them down, it's going to bring down your highlights. Grab your dark region, it's going to bring down your dark region. So as you bring your dark node over, it's going to notice how it just like eventually brings your highlights and your darks. Think of this as your highlight node, your dark region, your highlight region, and you should have this all figured out. What you can also do with this is you can click and add nodes in the mid region here. This is your dark, and as you move up, this goes all the way to your highlight. So these are your mids. That's your exact midpoint, or pretty close to it. Right there on the graph, right there is about your midpoint. And you can also add other nodes as well and really control the mids on what's called a curve. What this is helpful for is contrast and adding more of a cinematic look to this. What we can do is we can grab kind of right around the 10 IRE region, we can add a node, and around the maybe 80-90 IRE region, we can add a node up here. So up here on the 80-90 region of the IRE scale, we can say we're going to boost those a little bit. And look what's happening to the waveform. It stretches here. As we stretch, we're adding contrast. I'm going to grab the dark region and bring it down. And look what we get as a result. We get a very contrasty image. If we check mark that before and after, this is where you're getting what's called the cinematic look. You can kind of bring these down. You can stretch the regions that you want to stretch by changing the curve. And notice that this is right here around the 80-90 is starting to boost off more toward the highlights. And the darker region here is just slightly curving off toward the darker region. And it puts us on a curve. So this basically creates, look at this stretch. Let's exaggerate this big time. Look at that huge stretch. Now there's a huge amount of contrast. The closer together this region gets, the more flat it gets. So there you go. Let's add just a little bit of what's called an S-curve to this and get our contrast looking where it's good. And that way we don't crush the dark regions or crush the highlight regions, but we get a little bit of contrast and we get more of a cinematic look. And actually, I can just take this curve. I'm going to do Control-C and copy. We're going to put this on another clip. I'm going to move to this clip, hide my fast color corrector there. It's still active, but I'm going to do Control-V and paste that contrast onto this. This is a little too underexposed, so actually I'm just going to have to adjust this filter now. I'm going to bring up and create that. Let's find the mid region here and kind of get some highlights brought out and then add some contrast to the image right there. Right about there is looking good. Let's go before and after, before and after. So we've added the contrast to the shots, and now we're starting to look pretty good here. That shot's looking pretty good. So let's move along here. I want to show one more filter here, and it is the RGB curve. The RGB curve is very similar to the Luma curve, but is manipulating individual color channels. I'm going to grab this effect and drop it onto this clip here, and you have same curves here. You have a master curve, which is pretty much your full Luma curves because it's doing the whole image all at once. But let's look at our RGB parade and get this adjusted to the right color balance. I'm going to go to the parade, get rid of my waveform. And right here, we're looking at this image. We are getting kind of a bigger push in the mids, and the kind of lower mid region of the blues is kind of pushed up. So this shot and a little bit higher in the green. So this is kind of more greenish blue than it is red. Notice that this kind of goes up higher in the blue channel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let's grab the mid region, but you have a lot of power with these individual channels. Watch this as I grab the blue and bring that down. Notice it does not affect the red and green channel. And same as on the green, I'm going to grab the mids and the green, drag that down. And you can do this on a curve, or you can grab these exact points and just bring down the entire blue channel like that. By bringing down the darks and the highlights, it brings this whole chart down there. But you have a lot of control over this. Let's see. Right now I want to bring down the green highlights to match the red. So I'm going to grab my highlights in general and just bring them down a little bit. And let's look at our mid region and our greens. Yes, we need to bring that down a teeny bit as well. Our blues we really need to bring down. The kind of full mid region of the blues right there. And look what happens to our image as we bring that down. Now this shot is starting to look more color balanced and not as blue. Let's uncheck that. It's bluish, and that's starting to look a little bit more normal. So I really like the RGB curves because you can really control your color channels individually and have a lot of power over them. I bring down my red highlights just a teeny bit, right about there. Mess with the blues just a little bit and warm this shot up a little bit. Make more of a little more prominent red, make that a little warmer shot there. All right, and then when we're done, we can actually use this master curve here to get that contrast that we were talking about before. And this is very similar to the fast color corrector. You can actually grab this node down here and bring your darks down to around 5 IRE. Notice my blues are touching, so I can bring those up a little bit. You have a lot of control here, and my highlights on my blue need to come up a little bit as well. Right about there. Now that I got this channel boosted up, we're going to add some master contrast to this. I'm going to grab, and actually we can do this with our waveform. I'm going to get rid of my parade there. I'm going to grab down here in the lower region and watch the contrast adjust, watch it stretch and create contrast to this image without crushing the darks and crushing the highlights. And now we have a nice contrasty image. Let's go before and after. Look at the huge difference in that right there. And now I'm going to add a fast color corrector, because if I want to mess with the saturation, drop that on. And with my saturation here, I'm going to boost that up a little bit. Let's go to about 120 and boost up the colors a little bit. Now we got a little bit more of a colorful image. So yeah, it just depends on the look that you're going for. We've shown how to meet legality requirements, and I've shown how to do matching with tonality and color, boosting saturation or changing saturation, your levels, your brightness levels, contrast levels, and we've shown how to use 3 different types of filters here. One final thing I want to show with looks. Premiere has a nice little feature with adjustment layers. If you're adding a look to an entire scene or an entire project, you can create a new adjustment layer. You can grab this adjustment layer, drag it in, and if you're doing it over specific scenes, you can make an adjustment layer over a certain range or a scene, or you can make it over your entire project. If it's over your entire project, this layer here is going to affect everything below it simultaneously. However you affect this, whatever you add to this adjustment layer will adjust everything below this. So this is great for going for a specific look. So what I'm going to do is go to my effects panel and grab my fast color corrector, drop it on this, and I'm also going to grab a Luma curve and add to this as well. Those 2 filters are now added to the adjustment layer up here. As I select this, I can change the adjustment layer. So now if I want this entire project to have a specific look, I can go up here and say, okay, now I want this like kind of heavy contrast and I want it like really, really warm or overly saturated for my final look. So I'm going to grab my contrast and I'm going to add, let's exaggerate this a bit just to kind of demonstrate. I'm going to add a really heavy contrast to this, and now I'm going to go into my fast color corrector and I'm going to add a very heavy saturation to this, and that's the look that I want to go for right there. Very heavily saturated, very heavily contrast, and that's my look. That's on my adjustment layer. Watch this as I turn it on and off. There's my before and after, but now watch as we go to the next shot. It has done the same thing. This shot already had a lot of saturation to it. Let me kill that saturation on the clip specifically, but it is done with this adjustment layer. It has added that heavy saturation and heavy contrast to each image here as we move through these clips. Every single shot now has that look because it has the adjustment layer applying that look. And you can actually adjust that. You can actually kill the intensity of that look if you want to. First of all, you have to make sure that your track height is at a standard track height here. Shift plus will take everything to a standard track height. Shift minus will collapse it to this kind of minimized track height. Shift plus will take it to expanded track height. And now you'll see this opacity line right here. If you don't see that, go to your little wrench here and tell it to show video keyframes. And it will bring up this opacity line right here. Now you can grab that opacity line and drag it down and notice it's killing the intensity of that adjustment layer. And that is basically your look right there. Now, one other thing you can do here is they already have some pre-built looks in Premiere. I'm going to go under that adjustment layer, get rid of the filters on that adjustment layer, and we're going to go under Lumetri presets down here in our effect panel. There's already some created ones. If you wish, you can go under film stocks and find some Fuji stuff under cinematic looks as well, and these Cinespace ones as well. So under the Lumetri panels, let's go under film stocks and we're going to find, let's say, one of these Kodak Fuji ones here. I'm going to drag it and drop it onto the adjustment layer. I don't like that look. Undo, Control Z. Don't like that one. Okay, that one I like, the kind of contrasty oversaturated look. So this one I like right here for my entire look. Once again, if you don't like the intensity, you can just go up here and basically grab it and drag it down and get it exactly where you want to, get the intensity that you like. And also you have your basic Lumetri panel features here. You can go under these here and change them and change your look and customize your look as well. Or you can just add your own filters and do that. So that's basic color correction. That is primary color correction in Premiere. And then in an upcoming episode, I will demonstrate the three-way color corrector and secondary color correction as well.